If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
A group of news outlets and St. Louis area activists showed documentation that the federal government downplayed the risk of radioactive waste exposure throughout the St. Louis region. And that's left some Missouri political figures demanding a concrete public policy response. On the latest episode of Politically Speaking, Democratic State Representative Doug Clemens talks about what should happen after the investigation. The St. Louis County official also discussed his expectations for veto session and the 2024 election cycle. Let's hit the music.
This is the Politically Speaking podcast, the definitive show about Missouri politics.
My promise to St. Louis was that I would do the absolute most for each and every person, starting with those who have the very least.
What I wanted to do was look and see what other states are doing.
We have to be willing to change those laws, that they are balanced and they affect everybody equally.
As somebody that grew up in the St. Louis area, North St. Louis County, I didn't know any lawyers growing up.
We got to find long-term solutions to make government better, but also to be able to provide services to people.
I don't want to leave that federal money that we've been leaving all these years on the table.
We need to be spending this money to take care of Missourians.
I thought we accomplished a lot this year, but a lot more needs to be done.
And welcome to Politically Speaking. I'm your host, St. Louis Public Radio political correspondent Jason Rosenbaum. Joining us from Jefferson City, she covers all things state politics and state policy for St. Louis Public Radio.
Sarah Kellogg.
And joining us in studio, returning for the first time since 2019, our guest today is
State Representative Doug Clemens, 72nd District.
Thank you for joining us. And also, before we start, can you just remind people what the boundaries of your district are? Because I believe they have changed since you were last on the show.
They have changed dramatically since I was last on the show. I went from 5 municipalities to 2. I have St. Anne and Overland, but my district also includes unincorporated areas of St. Louis County. So basically, I go from the J to Highway 170.
One of the reasons why we wanted to bring you on is there was recently this investigation that was released last month, and it included news articles from the Missouri Independent, Muck Rock, the Associated Press, the Riverfront Times, and a whole bunch of other people. And also, I think we just have to add, longtime St. Louis County activists who have been involved in this issue were the people that procured the documents and then gave it to the news agencies. And the bottom line is it showed that the federal government has been downplaying or ignoring the risks of radioactive waste exposure in the St. Louis region for literally decades. When you read these documents and you read these news articles, as somebody who has literally followed this issue for your entire life, what was your reaction?
I was pretty angry, to be honest. I've actually had the privy of going through a lot of these documents long before they were released by the press, working with the activists, which I have been one over the years. The documents that I read, the things that I saw, indicated clear out lying to the American people and Missourians about their safety and quality of their environment. It's a dangerous place that they created. We have people suffering long-term health care effects. Exposure to ionizing radiation can affect 3 generations, so my exposure today can affect my grandchildren. That's one of those things that we think about radioactive waste. We don't think about those long-term implications, that it's a generational problem. So 81 years, this stuff has been spreading throughout the environment in St. Louis City, St. Louis County, and St. Charles County.
You said on the last episode of Politically Speaking that advocacy over nuclear waste contamination has been a major part of your public service career. Did you feel like these documents and the story vindicated the people who had been raising alarms about this issue?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we never want to see that things are like this, that our own government was involved in covering things up and keeping the people from being safe. That is never a situation that anybody wants to be in. But for those that have worked on this for years and years, I think of like Just Moms STL, K-Dry, my brother, folks that have worked in this issue for years and years, and have seen these things and put them together in a package that the general populace can understand, that's a huge feather in their cap for their hard work and diligence.
I want to encourage our listeners to actually read the articles themselves. We'll have a link to them in the web post for this podcast. I think one of the complexities when we're talking about what is the public policy response to this is clearly something that the federal government caused, but the actual actors that did a lot of the contamination were private companies kind of working in tandem with the federal government. So how does that complicate what the actual response from elected officials should be?
Well, elected officials should be concerned with the safety and well-being of our citizens first and foremost. We also need to look at how we're going to compensate the areas affected by this. I don't know the legal standing for going after any of these corporations, as a lot of them were working under directives of the federal government itself. They were following orders that they were provided by the Department of Energy or the Atomic Energy Commission at the time. Those things complicate matters legally, but ultimately this is the federal government's project. This is their waste, and they need to clean it up and provide for safety. One thing that I continually talk about, we have healthcare concerns throughout St. Charles County, St. Louis County, St. Louis City, but we don't talk about the loss of economic impact, the decline in property values, tax revenue, this stigma which goes along with you have radioactive waste everywhere. That's a problem for economic development. It's a problem for our home values. It's a problem for our state, county, and municipality revenues.
Last week, I spoke with U.S. Senator Josh Hawley. He has successfully attached an amendment to a pretty critical national defense bill that would add a number of zip codes to this existing fund to compensate people who have become sick due to a variety of nuclear-related things, whether it be atomic testing or uranium refining or situations like this where there's radioactive waste exposure. Here's a clip from that conversation.
When you see the extent of the lying by the federal government, what I said is, this is the time, right now, this is the time with this information to go and get every victim in St. Louis compensated. And that's really what did it, Jason. The movie, that's nice. That's an interesting, the press likes that, but that's not why we got legislation passed. That's not why we're on the threshold of getting this done. It's because of these women and some men too, but let's be honest, it's really a group of women who worked and worked and worked on this for years, and you've covered this, who exposed this, frankly, corruption by the government that got us to this point.
The movie Senator Hawley was referring to was Oppenheimer. There were a number of national press outlets that seemed to think that this entire legislative action was because of the movie. He basically downplayed the impact of the movie and really upplayed, if that's a word, to the actions of some of the activists you talked about. So I wanted to make that clear for our listeners. What do you think of Senator Hawley's amendment to compensate people who may become sick due to this radioactive exposure?
So his amendment is to the defense spending bill. It's an act called RECA, which is already pre-existing federal legislation designed to compensate folks that have been exposed. We think of them as downwinders, is the nickname given out in New Mexico where they detonated the bombs. This legislation is good. This is a bipartisan issue. This affects Republicans, Democrats, Independents, doesn't matter. And when we look at this issue, we have to remove our party cap for a minute. I work very, very closely with Tricia Burns, who's a Republican in St. Charles County. St. Charles County probably has some of the worst of this, and their people have not been informed about it. I attended a town hall she ran where people were learning for the first time about the poison that they grew up in. And I watched the tears and I watched the faces change, and I've seen that too many times in my life.
This amendment would not have passed without Democrats. In fact, Senator Hawley was effusive to New Mexico Senator Ben Ray Lujan about getting his caucus on board with this because a lot of Hawley's Republican colleagues voted against it. But what do you make of the fact that Hawley, who we all know is not the most beloved political figure among Democrats, was able to get so many Democratic senators on board with this?
I think that goes directly to what I was just talking about. This is a bipartisan issue. We also look at New Mexico, which Lujan actually knows this issue because of where he's from and the people he represents. So the result is you're able to talk to your colleagues more clearly when you have a knowledge base. And I think that's probably what happened is he was able to say, hey, look, guys, this is something that has to happen.
If this does not make it past the finish line, what are some other public policy reactions or legislation that you think needs to happen based off of this investigation?
Well, I actually think that RECA is low-hanging fruit. This is legislation which should happen, and it's always the possibility that in conference it gets stripped out, which would be a shame. If we're moving forward, we need a better compensation policy. One of the things would be nice to mirror the Atomic Workers Act. The Atomic Workers Act doesn't have to prove causality. They just need to show exposure. And as soon as there's a chance of exposure, you are covered under this act.
Does the other one not require causality? Because I specifically asked that to Senator Hawley, and he said that there didn't have to be causality. There didn't have to be a nexus between your disease and radioactive waste exposure.
Unfortunately, RECA does make you jump through hoops and prove dose potentials. A lot of folks, unfortunately, have passed away while jumping through the hoops to try and get compensation. It's a good act. It's just not good enough. Tacking these folks on in these zip codes is crucial and necessary, but we can't stop there. We need better compensation on health, but we also need better compensation when it comes to material loss to the state of Missouri.
One thing that Democrats have discussed is trying to fund a Department of Natural Resources program that would investigate areas of radioactive concern, but it needs to be funded in order to actually be launched. Governor Mike Parson has rejected a proposal for a special session. What do you think of that idea?
So I remember when it was Senator Maria Chappelle Nadal who put that bill through. That legislation is giving funding to the DNR to perform testing in areas requested by municipalities and county governments. I think that that's a good idea. And I think that we should be able to say, hey, we found this in a place that you've told us and refused to test. We need you back out here to confirm our testing and clean it up.
Senator Hawley has said it should be the federal government's responsibility to test and clean up this nuclear contamination. And here is a clip of him talking more about this when I asked him about the special session proposal.
Number one, the federal government caused the mess. They need to clean it up. They need to be on the hook for it, and they need to pay for it. There's no reason that the people of Missouri should have to pay to clean up what the federal government has caused. But number two, is there a place for other people, whether that's the state or independent scientists to come in and to test? I mean, sure. And you know what? Look at Jana Elementary School. One of the reasons we know about the extent of the contamination in that area of Coldwater Creek is because the school board and concerned parents got an outside entity to come in and to test Jana and found that, in fact, the radioactive material levels in Jana were much higher than the federal government had previously let on. So, there is a place for that. But I suspect that to your point about Governor Parson, I suspect what the governor's trying to point out, and he's right about this, is the federal government needs to make this right. This is their responsibility, and they need to do it, and they need to do it fast.
There's a long clip, but I wanted to make sure that the nuance was in context. What do you think of what Senator Hawley said there?
Well, I absolutely agree that it's the federal government's responsibility. They should be footing the bill ultimately. That goes into something else, I believe. I believe that we have standing to file suit as a state against the federal government. We deserve compensation in a financial manner. This state won World War II. We are the ones that processed the material for the Manhattan Project, and we continued the nuclear weapons program here after the war ended. And our federal government was careless with dangerous materials. We did our part in World War II. It's time to clean up the mess. It's time to compensate folks for doing what we did to win the war. This is not World War II anymore. It's 2023. We have documents showing that in at least 1949, after the war, the federal government knew the dangers, ignored the dangers, made a conscious decision to do so. And here we are, 80 some odd years later, still waiting on a resolution.
Do you think that Attorney General Andrew Bailey's office may have trouble suing the federal government because generally the federal government has immunity against lawsuits?
No. If you look at the most recent Supreme Court questions about standing, I think you can be a state and sue the federal government over just about anything nowadays. So I think as standing goes, he's probably got a pretty good place to go from. But I'm very, very happy that our Attorney General is finally getting involved in this. And in part of his research, he recently came up with a letter which indicates that Rocky Flats sent us material in 1965. We've been talking about processed uranium. The material they would have sent from Rocky Flats is plutonium. And that's a second document indicating that plutonium was probably set here in 1960s, left at the airport for a while, and then probably moved to St. Charles County and dumped in one of the quarries.
Bailey's office has also requested that a U.S. House committee hold a hearing on the radioactive waste exposure in St. Louis. What do you think of that response from Bailey's office?
Absolutely. Should have been done 70 years ago. But let's do it now and clear the air.
One of the reasons why there may be hope that the whole sovereign immunity thing doesn't apply here is that President Biden has said publicly that he supports the idea of, quote, taking care of people who were exposed to especially the nuclear testing, and seemed to indicate he supports the overall amendment, although I don't think he specifically talked about the St. Louis part. He was mainly talking about, I think, New Mexico exposure. But do you think that the president's comments, which were in the Associated Press, signals that maybe the federal government will just voluntarily compensate the St. Louis region and there may not have to be protracted litigation?
I would love to see that. That's the thing that we all wish, don't we? That our government does its job. I am happy to see that the administration has a favorable mindset when it comes to compensating folks for their losses as a result of this. One of the fears that I have is the entrenchment of the Department of Energy and its long history of basically sweeping things under the rug.
Now, what do you think about Attorney General Bailey suing the companies who were involved in the contamination, especially considering this happened decades ago? Some of the companies no longer exist in the forms that they did, and it just may be a lot more challenging than if the contamination happened yesterday.
Well, Jason, I think that they're going to have to spend a lot of time actually researching that question. And I'm probably not qualified to give an exact answer, but a lot of these companies were given a get-out-of-jail-free card by the federal government. So when they were acting on these projects, they weren't responsible for what they did. It falls back on the federal government, and they're gonna claim that. The other thing is, some of these companies just don't exist, as you said, in the form that they were or exist, period, any longer. So when you're trying to hunt down somebody from 70 years ago that caused a problem, even 40 years ago that caused a problem, I think of Cotter Corporation, which did the Laddie Avenue waste, and that company has changed names and type of company about 3 times.
We'll be back right after this break with State Representative Doug Clemens. And we're back on Politically Speaking with State Representative Doug Clemens. He is a Democrat from beautiful Northwest St. Louis County, the hardworking Northwest St. Louis County. Sarah, I'm going to turn it over to you because we have a lot of questions about veto session. We've been asking every guest about veto session, and Representative Clemens is not going to be an exception to that line of questioning.
All right. So the big legislative story going into veto session is Governor Mike Parson's budgetary vetoes more than his legislative ones. What was your reaction to the governor's decision to cut more than $500 million worth of projects from the budget?
I'm not too happy about it, to be honest with you. A lot of those were hard-fought line items for us. Some of them were Democratic concerns. I think that this state needs to double down on its investment in its people and infrastructure, and we literally can't afford to cut pennies when we're talking about our future.
And it's not just Democrats who were upset about these vetoes. Republicans were upset too. Do you think that any of your colleagues could override some of those objections in September?
I certainly do. The governor has not had the best relationship with this particular legislature for a while now. And as the years have passed, the relationship seems to be a little bit more tenuous all the time.
One of the things that Parson mentioned was the decision to eliminate taxes on Social Security and state pensions is going to have to cost the state, and needed to make sure that he was being prudent with the state's finances. What do you make of that argument?
That is going to cost the state. It is something that we can afford. He doesn't need to be overly prudent with that particular aspect. We have the largest retiring workforce in history right now. And we have a problem of folks, Missourians on fixed incomes, trying to stay in their homes, trying to meet their bills, trying to get their medications. We need to, as a state, figure out how to fix those problems. This is a good step in that direction. And yeah, it's going to require shifting the burden elsewhere. And that's okay. That's what math is about.
Parson also said that a lot of budget items were largely local in nature and that the state shouldn't be spending money on things municipal county governments can pay for themselves. What do you think about that argument as well?
So one of the things that you hear about all the time is property taxes and sales taxes, property taxes and sales taxes. Those are the only lever left for municipalities, school districts, fire districts to actually meet their economic burden, because the state government has not been meeting its economic burden with these entities.
So you are a great seguer, because another part of the Social Security pensions bill, and probably the most prominent part, is that it gave the ability for counties to freeze property taxes for seniors. Now, I know you follow St. Louis County government very closely. You have a high threshold for pain, like I do. I've been covering it on and off since 2011. And the Democrats on the council rejected a bid to freeze property taxes in St. Louis County. And I know that there's a situation now where there's Boeing incentives and talk about maybe that will be revived in exchange for the county passing Boeing incentives. But this is a clip from Councilwoman Rita Days when I asked her that specific question. And I don't think that's going to happen based off her answer.
I see this as being a slippery slope. So you start with seniors, you're freezing seniors' taxes. Who will be next? Will we do folks with disabilities, single parents? I mean, it's a lot of folks that could say, I'm overburdened with taxes. We all are overburdened with taxes, quite frankly, because folks don't like taxes. They don't want to pay them. But that's the game we play here. You have to have taxes in order to provide good services for your community. I mean, we're looking at our streets. Streets are deplorable. We're trying to move derelict homes.
I don't remember the vote count on this bill, but I think a lot of Democrats voted for this. Do you think it was a mistake to pursue this policy?
Well, I think that it was not a mistake. However, I think that it needs to have a compensation from the state if we're going to be losing that revenue. St. Louis County is in a place where it can't afford to lose a lot of extraneous revenue right now, as are a lot of St. Louis County municipalities. This once again goes to our state tax structure. We just keep pushing benefits to corporations. We've slashed the taxes for corporations year after year after year. We've brought down our income taxes, and state revenue has been doing fine the last few years, and it's sitting in a bank instead of building our roads and helping our municipalities out. So we do need to revise how we do taxes, and we shouldn't be hurting the small guy over it. We need to make sure that folks that can afford to pay their fair share pay their fair share.
After the veto session, what are issues that you expect to dominate the 2024 legislative session?
Well, they didn't do so well this last session in terms of getting a lot of their wish list done. I like to think the Democrats had a good role in that, but one of the things that we know will be back is this anti-DEI legislation, this idea that you can't talk about a group, you can't make special rules for a group, you can't do special funding for anybody who wants to educate about a history source for black folks or things like that. It's a frustration where they're trying to create a war. They want a war about beliefs and that sort of thing to take precedent over policy. And they've been legislating propaganda. And when you legislate propaganda, you run into a whole mess of things, as we saw with their last attempt in last session. But that's going to be first and foremost. I can see it coming. They're going to go after a lot of the things that just fell flat this last time. The list is already set and ready to go. One of the things that I was particularly involved with was environmental social governance ratings for investments. I'm on the Financial Institutions Committee, and they want to restrict those types of ratings from any type of investment. Now, the problem with this being, say you want to invest in soybean futures, but you're not allowed to rate things by environmental ratings, when you're in a state that's faced a drought for 2 years. Those are the types of things that investors really do want to look at.
Yeah, on the DEI front, and I actually know this now because I now have talked to Department of Social Services Director Robert Nodell. I don't think the Parson administration is on board with that at all, especially when they have a real problem in trying to attract state workers to critical agencies. And some of these state workers have to interact directly with vulnerable communities.
So one of the things that the government in administration must always do is serve the people. And that's a complicated thing. Anyone who looks at how you deliver services to individuals, or when you look at trying to recruit employees and grow your state population, which we've been suffering from, is how you integrate individuals, how you communicate to them. And this is basic stuff. This is management 101. And an administration, the executive branch, that is management. That is where the rubber meets the road. So you have to have these things. And in this particular time, Missouri is actually going to wind up turning away so many potential employees when we're in a desperate need. We are facing the largest global worker shortage in human history. The baby boomers are retiring. 54% of folks that retired during the pandemic went into retirement. They're not coming back to the job force. And the numbers over the next decade are just going to get worse. The truth is that if you don't figure out how to welcome new peoples into your community, you're going to have a lot of empty businesses.
With that anti-DEI language, a lot of that was kind of trying to be pushed, and it was added on the House side to the budget. Are you expecting, again, kind of a battle on getting it on the budget, or are you expecting to see other legislation related to it as well?
I think we'll see other legislation related to it. I doubt they'll try and do that floor show, putting it on the budget again. And to be frank, they cut it out in the Senate. The governor wanted nothing to do with it, and it was quite an embarrassment to watch people vote for it along party lines and then come into the back room and say, man, I should have voted against that. But then they get a second opportunity and do it again. And this is where we see party politics kind of destroying our legislature.
So another priority for Republicans that didn't get done last year was making it harder to amend the Missouri Constitution. Do you think the lawmakers will hold off on trying to pass that ballot item now because of the result that happened in Ohio where a similar effort failed?
God, I hope so, but I wouldn't hold my breath. I think that the legislation is being drafted as we speak, and they're going to try again. Since I've been in office, this has been one of their priority goals, is to make sure that Missourians can't override the legislature.
We've had people on this show trying to explain why they support this idea, and oftentimes they say, well, well-funded interest groups are using the initiative process to circumvent the legislature and push forward self-serving initiatives. Now, I'm sure you're going to disagree with the full philosophical aim of what Republicans are doing because you feel like there should still be an initiative petition process. But isn't that contention indisputably true when you look at some of the initiatives that have passed, like notably the recreational marijuana initiative, which was funded by a lot of entities that were clearly going to benefit financially from its passage?
Well, I think whenever you're trying to move people, you need money. I mean, that's the law of nonprofit organizations is you've got to have people and money to move things. And yeah, there's a risk there, but you've got to believe that Missourians are smart enough to figure out what they want and what the risks are involved in that. And I would have to say that large corporate entities are already lobbying the legislature to get what they want. It's time that Missourians are safe in being able to lobby what they want.
2024, in addition to being a new session, it is an election year. Do you expect anything to actually get done next year in the Missouri House and Senate?
I love election years in our particular legislature because we are so one party strong that they are primarying each other left and right, and they use the floor to their political commercial advantage. So it's a good thing to watch. I always bring the popcorn along. But I think that we'll get some things done because there are some calm, cool minds that actually have a list of priorities.
So let's segue into the actual election season. And before we talk about the impact of the Republican primaries, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the major Democratic primary that's going on for U.S. Senate against the aforementioned Josh Hawley. Currently, Lucas Kuntz, Carla May, Wesley Bell are all in to run against Hawley. I think there's been kind of an internal debate over whether it makes sense that there's a primary in a race where not a lot of observers feel Democrats have a great chance of winning. What's kind of your view of the fact that seems to be a very competitive and contested affair at this point?
So I think the primary is very important. And I think that race is actually going to be much more important than the national observers think. Missouri is in the process of changing. When you're on the ground, when you're knocking doors, I volunteer to go out and speak to rural Missouri as a Democrat, and I speak to full rooms with 120 plus people in them. Missouri is looking for a change. Now, whether the Democratic Party is going to be able to meet that change is another question, and that's really up to the people. But the truth of the matter is, I think that this is a much more important race and could be one of those things that changes the nation's face.
Do you think the fact that Senator May and Prosecutor Bell jumped into this race is a sense that there could be unease with Lucas Kuntz getting the nomination here?
Well, Lucas did not get the nomination the last time. And politically speaking, when you fail to get a nomination, that means that you're able to be a loser again. And so if somebody's got political aspirations and they're looking at somebody who was a one-time loser, they're going to go after them with little regard for the loss.
Have you endorsed anybody in that race?
I have not officially endorsed a soul.
Moving on to the governor's race, do you believe that House Minority Leader Crystal Quade can win against any of the three people running for governor as Republicans?
Absolutely. Crystal is a born leader. Having been in leadership in the House myself and working behind closed doors with Crystal, I know the caliber of the individual. I also know that she cares deeply about Missourians in ways that a lot of politicians don't. So I think that she has an appeal. Being the only female in the race is a big score for her, too. Ultimately, she's going to do some damage to whoever she's running against after the Republican field clears. She will probably make it a tight race. I can't tell you if she'll win or lose at this point, but she'll be close.
Why do you think that Quade is the Democrat who can piece together that kind of elusive rural, suburban, urban coalition that Democrat candidates need in order to win statewide elections?
I think it's her social worker background. I think when she gets into a room of folks or when she's talking to somebody at an event or on the doors, they can see how genuinely she looks at the family. She looks at how people are doing psychologically. Once you meet her, you know she's genuine. And I think that interprets to voters. It's just a matter of, between now and election time, getting to as many voters as possible.
You know, unlike the Senate race, which has multiple Democrats, Quaid right now is the only Democrat running for governor where there are 3 Republicans. Do you think that shows and helps that there's kind of a unity behind Quaid at this moment?
Absolutely. If you can do without a primary, that means you can get more people on board. You can get your money consolidated. It becomes a force to be reckoned with because you've got everybody behind you from day one.
Representative, thank you so much for joining us today. Politically Speaking is a product of St. Louis Public Radio, which is part of the University of Missouri St. Louis. You can find all of our stories at stlpr.org. And Representative, how could people find you on social media or anywhere you want to be found on the internet?
I am Doug_Clemens on Twitter, Doug Clemens on Facebook, and DougClemens.com.
Thank you very much.
You mean X? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jason. Sorry.
No, oh, yeah. We have to call it X now, right? Oh. Anyways, until next time, so long.